Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Briefing Room podcast. This is episode 3 with Cyber Botla today, guys. And, the next couple episodes are going to be like this, where I brief you guys on some major events in Canada. And soon we're going to have our special guest, guys, so stay tuned for that, guys. So today we're going to talk about the Canada pipeline drama, so the pipeline drama in Canada, and what's been happening the last couple days in Canada, guys. So recently, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced the pipeline in Canada. And so basically, he announced that pipeline in Alberta with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. They both signed an MOU, which is I think it's called a MOU. What is it called? A memorandum of understanding, guys. So an MOU is called a memorandum of understanding, right? So you guys must wonder, oh, why did Carney sign a deal with Alberta, and why are they building this pipeline, and why is there drama around this pipeline, right? So let's go into the history of this, right? So what are pipelines? Okay, so pipelines are underground and sometimes above ground networks used to transport natural resources like oil, natural gas, and water over long distances, right? I mean, it's mostly used for gas in Canada, and why it's important to Canada right now. So pipelines make it cheap and more efficient to move oil. And as you can see, what's happening right now with the tariffs and stuff, it reduces our dependence on the US, right? Because 98% of our oil right now goes to America to get refined. But if you have a pipeline, it gives access to international markets like China, India, Japan, where we can sell our oil at internationally at a more democratic price, right? And so tons of countries like Norway, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, when they found oil, they took advantage of this. Canada also has large oil reserves, right? They're the fourth largest country with the most oil reserves in the world. But currently, we're struggling to capitalize on them due to pipeline barriers, right? Because every pipeline we build, there's always some kind of drama with it, right? And I'm going to come to Norway because it's interesting. What Norway did was, once they found that oil, they took it and they put into investment funds where they invest internationally, right? And no one has control over it, like the government doesn't. And now it's worth $1.8 trillion, meaning $250,000 per citizen in Norway. And Norway just diversified their investments and they stopped relying on oil, right, guys? Same thing with the UAE. They invested it heavily into tourism and stuff, right? So let's talk about some failed pipeline projects in Canada and why and how these link. So basically, we had a couple of pipelines in Canada that failed. So the Keystone XL pipeline, which failed recently, right? The Keystone XL pipeline is supposed to go from Canada to the US, I think so. Keystone XL pipeline. And so it was an extension from Alberta oil sands to American refineries, right? Where our oil can go there quicker to get refined, right? It's because we don't refine our oil here in Canada, because in America they said it's like a hundred years ago they set refineries there where the oils can get refined. So that's why we send our oil south the border to get refined, because at this point it's way too expensive to set refineries here in Canada, and refineries are way too expensive and it can take a lot of manpower to develop them, so we send them there to get refined, right? And so that failed, right? I mean, not really failed. This ended up in a blunder, we can say, the the Energy East pipeline and the Northern Gateway pipeline. These failures, they shaped like today's debate and scarce investors, right? Because these pipelines keep failing, no company is willing to invest in Canada for a pipeline, because there's just so much political instability when it comes to pipelines, right? So why do they keep failing? First of all, we have strong opposition from environmental groups, right? As you can see, if you've ever been to BC, I mean, I've personally been to BC. I've been to Whistler, I've been to Tofino, and a couple. And BC is a beautiful state, and there's all trees and forests everywhere. So people are worried that it's going to damage the environmental, right? Because one thing that happens in pipelines is gas leaks, no matter how good the sensors and technologies are, there's gas leaks that damage the environment, right? It even happened in Norway in their oil shenanigans, right? Oppositions from Indigenous and First Nation communities. This is a big thing, right? A big thing we're going to discuss later in the podcast, because from Indigenous and First Nation communities have been strong when Carney signed that MOU, right? Because basically what happens in every pipeline is the pipelines go through Indigenous communities and towns that aren't really legally surrendered yet. I mean, there's a lot of legality and legislative problems in these, right? That weren't signed, right? And it's their land. it goes through them, and basically their problem is they want the government, Ottawa, to recognize them as a land, not just treat their land as an empty space for national interests, right? So there's tons of opposition from them, resistance from British Columbia. So currently British Columbia's premier, not, I kind of, British Columbia premier, um, British Columbia, what was his name again? Columbia premier. Premier David Eby, right? They're also opposing pipelines due to the environmental reasons, poor planning by pipeline companies. So what happens is Carney's trying to fast track this project right here, meaning he's trying to cut some right? But due to this leads to poor planning, right? Because a lot of times when we try to fast track projects, right? And by the way, I've put this article in my source below. You guys can go to the description and read it. So according to an article, a chief engineer, right? He's worked he's built tons of pipelines in Canada and the south of the border, and he's built tons of pipelines in the Caribbean, right? And so what he was saying, fast tracking is not good because basically it cuts some safety regulations and environmental stuff, which can cost more in the long term. And we can take one example. For example, the new metro line in Toronto, right, where like built by Metrolinx. I mean, that thing's taking forever and it's costing more than it should cost, right, guys? With the Metro Links subway in Toronto. So that's one example of why fast tracking's never good, right? And heavy federal government involvement, right? So what's happening is Ottawa's just involving themselves in pretty much every aspect of government levels, and there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty and U.S. political influence on cross-border pipelines. They affect a lot because a lot of these American companies and American governments influence some of our decisions, right? And another key concern I would like to highlight is environmental controversies, right? Pipelines, they cross sensitive ecosystems like the Great Bear Rainforest, like the one Carney proposed, right? And it directly increases greenhouse emissions by enabling higher oil production because I mean let's talk about it. If you have more pipelines, which means we can sell more to Asia, that means we would make more oil, which is not good for the environment, right? It's also risk of oil spills and tanker accidents, right? So basically with pipelines, the problem is like no matter how good we build it, right? It's not on, I don't want to say it's common, right? There's somehow like even if you build it really good, oil spills with pipelines which damage the environment, you know? And former federal cabinet minister Stephen Gillibrand criticized West Coast pipeline plans, right? And he resigned, by the way, from the cabinet due to Carney proposing the pipeline because Indigenous nations in BC were not consulted. A West Coast pipeline could worsen the climate pollution, and it would move Canada further away from its net zero target emissions by 2050, right? So fast tracking projects without proper approvals or consultation could lead to increased costs and it could cause irreversible environmental damage. And there's also tons of economic arguments about the pipeline. So a lot of supporters, like me to an extent, we argue that it opens access to Asian markets, which means we don't have to rely on America less for our oil, and we can get a good price for oil because right now we're selling America our oil at a discounted rate, right? It can generate government revenue, right? And it can create really high-paying jobs in construction, right? It can position Canada as a reliable energy supplier globally to our partners, and it can give us leverage in trade negotiations with America, right? And so the thing, and so what me and a couple other supporters who, I mean, I support this pipeline for economic reasons to an extent. I support it. I support it. Okay, hold on. I support it to an extent, but I think we should also consult with Indigenous groups because in this pipeline where Carney proposed, I mean, it's still an MOU, it's not official yet, right? In this pipeline, Indigenous groups and First Nations were not properly consulted here, right? It was just treated as a formality and not a proper consultation. I feel like if we sit down, if we consult with Indigenous groups and we say, okay, so this pipeline goes through your land, and here's how much we can compensate you, and you can use this money to invest in different sectors like tourism or fishing to increase the revenue for your village, you know? So I support this pipeline for economic reasons as long as Indigenous groups are properly consulted and the environment is protected and there's no harm to the environment, right? And this pipeline, my understanding is, I think what we should do with this pipeline is we should build this pipeline, we should sell the oil to Asia, right? And similar to what Norway did is we should create an investment fund, right? and we should diversify investments in that investment fund. So we should take the money we get from that oil, because oil is going to die in 50 years anyway, and invest that money in renewable energy, AI, and different stuff, right? And that's what Norway did, but Norway didn't invest in their own country. They invested internationally, right? So I think that's what we should do, right? And similarly, Alberta also has an investment fund, but Alberta has $18 billion for their investment funds, and Norway has $1.7 trillion for their investment fund. And we both pretty much have the same amount of gas. So like I think we should do it properly with no government interference. We should just give it to a private organization to help manage oil money properly, right? And let me come to the Indigenous peoples and rights issues. So the problem here, the reason Indigenous people are opposing this pipeline is because lack of proper consultation, right? Carney's government dropped key climate policies to fast track this pipeline project, and Indigenous nations say they face a major environmental risks on their lands. Many affected lands are unceded, which means they were never legally surrendered. Like legally, it's their land, right? And so at the assembly of the First Nations, which happened in Ottawa recently, all the chiefs unanimously passed an emergency resolution demanding withdrawal of the Canada-Alberta pipeline proposal and protection of Indigenous rights and environmental. So what are these Indigenous leaders asking for? So they want to be consulted. So they want their consent to be valid, and they want it to be consulted before the decisions are made properly, and they want full transparency, which means no secrets or anything. Right? They don't want any backroom deals between Alberta and Ottawa. They want direct engagement with the Indigenous nations, because what they think is right now, Carney's dealing with Alberta right now, right? And they feel left out because they're talking about Alberta, and then after their conversation, they come to the Indigenous people and they say, okay, so here's what we talk. So they want to be a part of that conversation, right? They want respect for their land and sovereignty. So like, they don't want the government to treat their land as an empty space for national projects, and they want environmental protection. So they want their land and fisheries and coastal ecosystems to be protected, as they're concerned about spills, tankers, and marine damage. And they want the tanker ban, which was on hold, right? So the tanker ban is this ban where like it's a ban with tankers, right? And so they don't want the tanker ban to be lifted. As Carney, he was thinking about lifting the tanker ban for this project, and so they want to keep the tanker ban as it ensures the environment is protected from any spills or leaks, right? And they want Carney to honor UN DRIP, so they want full respect for Indigenous rights under international law, right? They don't want any fast tracking over rights, right? And so basically, if the Indigenous people reject, there'll be a court battle between them, the Supreme Court, the government. The Supreme Court will be deciding, right? And they're saying their communities are prepared to protest if their demands are ignored, right? And I've also highlighted those articles in my description below, right? And what are some of the public opinions? So the Liberal Party is okay with this pipeline, but what they're saying right now is they're saying, oh, we want a pipeline, we don't want a pipeline. So before Carney, they were all about the environment. They're being kind of like maybe so. All they did was they signed an MOU with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, to make relations better with Alberta. But like half of them are saying, oh no, we don't want a pipeline. Half of them saying, oh, we want a pipeline. They're not being consistent with their decisions, right? Right now, some of the senior members plus Carney, they're arguing a pipeline is needed for economic growth, right? But recently, their environmental minister resigned because they've been criticized for dropping climate commitments and Indigenous safeguards, and some members are opposing, right? And what is the Conservative Party saying? Pierre Poilievre, right? So basically, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition, and he basically speaks for the whole Conservative Party of Canada, right? He supports pipelines if done properly, right? He criticizes Liberals flip-flopping and the Liberals handling the consultation. So basically, what he's saying is one time the Liberals say they want a pipeline, and now they say they don't want a pipeline. They say they want a pipeline again, right? He's saying the Liberals are half-minded, right? And he's also saying that whenever the Liberals make a new pipeline deal, it always turns into a mess, right? Some examples are the Keystone XL, the TC Energy, where the federal government themselves had to invest in that pipeline because it was going to fail. The Enbridge pipeline, right? So whenever the Liberal government they try to do a pipeline, it always ends up going another way than expected, right? And Indigenous people are saying they want proper consultation. They oppose environmental risks and rushed approvals. And the leader of the Bloc Québécois, he's saying he's strongly anti-pipeline and he wants environment first. And BC Premier is also saying he opposes pipelines due to environmental risk, right? Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is strongly pro-pipeline, and she sees that pipelines are essential for Alberta's economy, right? And the Canadian public, we are mixed, right? So some of us think pipelines, so some of us support pipelines for economic benefits, and the other half, we don't support pipelines for the environmental risks. And companies or investments, see, this is a big thing right now. Of course, obviously, Carney, he went to Danielle Smith, he signed a MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, but there's no company that's willing to build a pipeline in Canada right now. And why? You might think that, oh, obviously, if I was a company, I would build a pipeline in Canada. But the reason is, right, like whenever we try to build a pipeline, it doesn't really go the way we expect, right? And so they don't want to build a pipeline in Canada because of political instability, because a new government comes and they say we don't want a pipeline, and then another government comes and they say we want a new pipeline, right? And then there's always some kind of hurdles with the Indigenous groups, environmentalists, right? So there's always political instability when it comes to pipelines in Canada. And obviously, if I was an investment and there was political instability when it comes to pipelines, I know my money's not going to be safe. So that's why there's no investors willing to invest in pipelines due to Canada's history of canceled pipelines and political uncertainty. And environmental groups are firmly opposed of the pipelines. They clearly communicated that the pipeline Carney proposed damages ecosystems like the Great Bear Rainforest in BC, right? And so what's the big takeaway here? Canada's pipeline debate isn't just about oil. It's about climate responsibility, Indigenous rights, and economic survival, right? And political trust. Every time the government rushes or flip-flops, it makes the conflict worse or scares away investors while deepening Indigenous resistance. So every time, the government makes a pipeline, it always fails. Not always, it does work sometimes, right? And we always have strong opposition, and it ends up costing more than we estimated, right? So the pipeline always ends up costing more than we estimated, right? And so, I'm going to state my opinion because what I said so far here are facts. In my opinion, I think we should go ahead with the pipeline, right? But we should consult. We should sit down properly with Indigenous groups. We should actually consult with them, not treat it as a formality or a checklist, right? Ask what they want, give them fair compensation, right? And consult with BC, ask what they want, right? And find a really, really good company to build this pipeline. And we got to build this pipeline so safe that we make sure the environment is not damaged and protected. And using that oil money, we set a cap, right? So we set an oil cap. So only this much of oil can be produced a year, right? And we only do that for 10 years. And out of the oil money we get, we build a sovereign wealth fund like Norway did, right? And we diversify investments in that sovereign wealth fund to help boost Canada's economy. So we invest that in AI, we invest that in renewable energy, right? And we also invest that internationally to help Canada's economy and us be sovereign. And that's what I think we should do, because this pipeline, it's going to give us access to Asian markets, which means a lot, because 98% of our oil is going to America, and they also get refined there. Right, guys? So that's my opinion. So please state your opinion in the comments, and I'll meet you guys on the next episode. Thank you for watching the Briefing Room podcast, guys. Thank you.